It may seem like an impossible dream to eradicate poverty, but the United Nations did reach its previous goal to cut extreme global poverty in half by the year 2015. They did. So maybe it's not such an unattainable ideal after all. Joining us now for more on the fight to end poverty across the globe and here in Canada, in the American capital, John MacArthur, Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He is also a Senior Advisor to the UN Foundation. In our nation's capital, Julia Sanchez, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. And here in our studio, Brett House, Vice President, Deputy Chief Economist, Scotiabank, former Principal Economic Advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and Kwam McKenzie, CEO of the Wellesley Institute, psychiatrist at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and if I can say, friend of the program. You're here a lot, Kwam, and we're happy for that.
Thank you.
Anyway, Brett, nice to have you here for the first time, and to our friends out of town, we appreciate you joining us on TVO tonight. Let me just set this up by, you guys all know this, but I'm going to share this with our audience. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, number one is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And here are some of the specifics to hit that goal by the year 2030. Eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere. That's currently measured as people living on less than $1.90 a day. Reduce at least by half the proportion of those living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. Build the resilience of the poor and reduce their exposure and vulnerability to climate-related extreme events as well. Just a few of the highlights of Sustainable Development Goal number one. John, to you first in Washington, D.C., ending poverty in its forms everywhere is about as lofty an international development goal as it comes. Everybody's going to be asking this first question, is it really doable?
Well, I think the starting point is how has the world been doing so far? And as you said, we've seen extraordinary progress in the past generation. In 2000, roughly 1 in 4 people around the world was living in extreme poverty. Today, it's down to about 1 in 12. It's a little more than 600 million people who are, best estimate, living in extreme poverty. If business as usual continues, we'll get down to around 5% of the world, a little more than 400 million people in extreme poverty. So that's 400 million out of what's going to be a lot more than 8 billion people. It's a small share, but still a sizable number. So the question is not whether it's possible. The question is, how are we going to do it, in my view? And how are we going to think about each of those 400 million plus lives in a way that gets them the basic services they need, or in this case, the basic income they need in order to get over that final hurdle. It's probably and arguably the most exciting civilizational challenge we're coming across right now, in addition, arguably, to climate change. But it's also one that I think is for the record books if we pull it off.
I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to, just before we go any further, thank you. That's a wide shot. In the background here, we have a video display, and it literally shows people leaving poverty. We have, as John just suggested, a little over 600 million people in the world today who are living in extreme poverty, but through efforts around the world, we see a graphic which suggests that people are leaving poverty all the time, and we are making progress. Julia, I should ask you, is this more, though, of a stretch goal? Is it more of an aspiration to be able to do this by the deadline of the year 2030?
So I share John's excitement that this is an amazing challenge that we have before us. It is not going to be easy, and it's not meant to be. It is a very bold and ambitious goal, and it's meant to spur us into action. Again, as John mentioned, business as usual is not on. If we're serious about tackling this goal, we really need to do things very differently, both at home in Canada, where these goals also apply, and internationally. And part of the difficulty is that given the success we had with the MDGs of having poverty, now we're facing the really hard to reach, those that need to now be pulled out of poverty. That additional half is going to require much more innovation, much more resources, much more dedication, profound changes. It won't be just, you know, the low-hanging fruit. We're going for the difficult cases, those living in the most fragile contexts and conflict-affected states, sub-Saharan Africa, women and girls living in precarious situations. So these are not easy populations to access and to support. So it is going to be very, very difficult, but it's a fabulous challenge. And you know, there's a strong political will across the world to do this. And we just need to get to work.
And let me follow up with you, Julia, since you mentioned the MDGs. These are the Millennium Development Goals, which predated the Sustainable Development Goals, which is what the United Nations is on to now. They did have a goal to reduce extreme poverty by half by 2015, and somehow they managed to beat that target by 5 years. That sounds like a fantastic accomplishment. How come more people don't know that?
Yeah, well, I can take a little bit of blame on behalf of civil society on that front. It's hard to communicate the complexity of development to people in Canada and across the world. Development issues or things that are happening out there are not top of mind, and it's very difficult to get them onto the media. It's wonderful that you're doing this program, but this is, I would say, an exception and not the norm to focus so much time on talking about these kinds of global challenges and how we're tackling them and the success and the difficulties we're having. I think one of the advantages that we have right now with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that we didn't have with the Millennium Development Goals, is that these apply everywhere, as you said at the beginning. So they apply to Canada. So now we have a global agenda to address poverty and other challenges that also has to be applied here in Canada. And we believe in civil society that this provides us a fabulous tool to talk to Canadians about these issues because they matter both at home and abroad. So hopefully our understanding as a broad population and our engagement with these issues will increase dramatically over the next 13 years.
Kwam, I want you to get in there as well on that issue. You would think something as miraculously good news as that is would be trumpeted all over the place. How come we don't know about this?
You would think so. It is good news. We have been focusing, you know, worldwide people have been focusing on this, and they've reached their target, they've reached a goal, and they've surpassed their goal. One of the reasons why sometimes people have difficulty is that though they have reached a goal, and that is exciting and we should celebrate it, there are still hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. So that's the first issue. The second issue that some people worry about is that actually this is not a goal to eradicate poverty. This is a goal to eradicate extreme poverty. And so there are a lot of people, even if you eradicate extreme poverty, you know, there's still much more to be done. And so I think people are happy, but they still look at the world and they say, you know, there are lots of people who are having great difficulties who are living in poverty, and there's so much more to be done.
Well, they say, Brett, that when you run a marathon, the first half is a lot easier than the second half. So let's assume we're halfway through the marathon right now. How much trickier is it going to be to get the second half of this done?
Well, it's a really high-quality problem. As Julia mentioned, it does take more work and more resources to reach the remaining extreme poor, but that's in the context of having made all of the progress that has been cited around the table already. And that really is a sea change. For decades, countries came together at the UN and other international fora, set ambitious goals, and then those goals quietly were not achieved, often because the resources and the concerted work to achieve them was not put into place along with the goals. The MDGs were a real change on that front, where we ensured that some resources, not as many as everyone hoped, but some resources and policy frameworks were coordinated along with the goals, and an accountability process was also added in so that countries were held to some kind of measure along the way, and intermediate milestones were observed, measured, and celebrated in some cases, or less good report cards were provided so that course corrections could happen. So we're in a context where we have a much more, let's say, integrated framework for achieving these goals, and so the challenges are bigger, but so too is our approach much more improved than it had been in the past.
John, come on in here and tell us where in the world, in your judgment, the toughest countries will be to lift that next percentage of people out of extreme poverty. Where do you think?
Well, one of the big important points to note here is that there's a shift in the geography of the problem. So a generation ago, the largest number of extremely poor people was in South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. Now, as of the past few years, more than half is in sub-Saharan Africa. And as of roughly this year, and it's in that poverty clock that I think you might still have there, which is the best current estimate. These are just estimates, but it's the best estimate. The country with the biggest number today is Nigeria. And we have, that's a country that has about 200 million people. It's probably nearly half the country that's living in extreme poverty. So it's not just marginalized groups there, it's a pervasive problem. And we have others, like Julia said, like Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, even Madagascar, that have had real challenges of fragility, getting the stability of the government in place. And this is actually, in my view, the true last mile. And it's these places that have political fragility and institutional fragility where people might be fighting, or frankly, when the rains might fail and the crops therefore might fail, people are more likely to fight. These are the challenges that we're seeing in places like Mali, which is of course coming up in a peacekeeping context. We need to be thinking about these very practical things that can help these economies be stable. The majority of the time that's actually going to be about helping farmers grow more food, but it's not exclusively that. It's going to be also about getting these marginalized populations, including in the cities, in fragile contexts, to have access to that basic income. The other thing I would say is we shouldn't be naive about this. Probably the biggest breakthroughs of the Millennium Development Goals were in the realm of global health. Things like fighting AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, child survival, maternal survival. We have a pretty strong sense of the reasons why people die of disease and the very practical interventions that are needed to prevent those. At least 20 million extra people lived because the world did better in literally keeping people alive. The issues of how to generate income, how to get people out of poverty, those can be very, very difficult. They're less easy to plan. They're more about how the markets work. But this is where technology is also providing a lot of excitement. We have things like mobile money. We have direct cash transfers. We have pioneering examples in East Africa where independent assessments show that literally just giving people small amounts of money through the access of mobile money on their mobile phone can help lift them out of poverty at extremely low cost. So as much as there's a lot of these last mile challenges that are very, very hard, there's also a lot of excitement around new approaches to tackling those that might be even easier than we imagined.
Let's, Julia, understand why. This may be a pedantic question, but I suspect people are curious. Extreme poverty is measured at earning less than $1.90 a day. Why $1.90? What's magic about that number?
Well, there have been different attempts internationally to set a number that would be, representative of good quality of life. It's a very low number, and there is a debate, and John, I think, can probably speak more eloquently to that. We need a number, and so that is the number that has garnered the most agreement right now among people who study these issues. But we need a cutoff line. It is difficult or dangerous, I would say, though, to look at it as a hard line. I mean, you don't want people to go up to 191 a day and then say, okay, done, we've done our job here, right? It's an indicator that helps us set targets, that helps us set direction and strategies, but we can't look at it as a hard line that once people cross that line, by 1 or 5 cents, then we've solved the problem. And if you allow me, Steve, to add to what John was saying about how well equipped we are now and how much new knowledge and resources, technology, et cetera, we have to help us tackle this increasingly difficult issue of the last miles. I would like to also add to that the fact that the SDGs, and I think definitely in Canada, there is an increasing embrace of what we call a rights-based approach. So we're looking at these problems in a structural way. We're not looking at them, as tended to be the case with the MDGs, as just, we have some symptoms here of poverty that we need to address. Let's feed people, let's vaccinate people, and let's, deal with the symptoms, and not really tackling the issues. And the main issue here that underlies a lot of this, and definitely when we talk about extreme poverty, is inequality as far as access to power and access to fulfilling people's rights, right? So women and girls are a perfect example of that, and I think our current government has done a wonderful job of focusing attention on that and saying, if we don't address the disparities and the discrimination that women and girls are subject to. There is no technology and no cell phones and no cool ways of addressing their needs that are going to be sustainable and to get them out of poverty in a sustainable fashion if we don't recognize that there's a power imbalance here, there's a discrimination issue, and we have to deal with that as well so that we get to the root causes of why we have this poverty around the world.
You wanted to follow, Quinn.
I wanted to follow just two things, just to make it clear, I think, to everybody that when people are talking about poverty, there are three groups of issues. One is economic poverty, and that's your sort of money and resource. The other is social, and so that is inclusion, discrimination, and then the other is political, and that is having voice and having access to power, and then self-determination. And when you're thinking about poverty, you're thinking about all of those things. So I think it's quite important to remember, so that we remember that. We always get pulled into the economic side without thinking all of the other things, and that's why I totally agree with what Julia said. There was one thing which I wondered whether it was a slip that Julia mentioned. She sort of mentioned the $1.90 and said, over $1.90 is, that's the level for a decent level of life.
No, she didn't say that.
Yeah.
She said we shouldn't assume that if we get to $1.91, we've somehow solved the problem.
Yeah, no, I think earlier before she said that. And I just wanted to make sure that we're clear that $1.90 is the level of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty.
Can you lead a life with dignity if you make $1.90 a day?
No.
Impossible under any circumstances?
I don't believe so. Remember, it's $1.90 purchasing power, so it doesn't mean it's $1.90 in every place in the world. It's what $1.90 can buy. So we'd have to ask ourselves, say in Canada, do we believe that somebody who earns, let's do the maths, $920 or something like that, or $930 a year is going to be living a life of dignity in Canada? I don't think we're going to. I don't think. Well, we could try it. We could try and living on.
But go ahead, Brad. You wanted to add.
Well, I think the number needs to be put in slightly different context for Canada. $1.90 in purchasing power parity terms. So it's a concept we use in economics to try to, even out what an amount of money will buy in different contexts in different countries. $1.90 as a threshold for extreme poverty is really a measure for very low-income countries. $1.90 clearly isn't the threshold here between extreme poverty and poverty. Here, I think the broader articulation of the goal, which is around having poverty or extreme poverty, is the much more pertinent issue, and then the actual elimination of extreme poverty, which we have very different measures on here. Our poverty line in Ontario for a single person is around $21,000 of income a year. For a family of four, it's around $41,000 a year. Obviously, that's many multiples of the $1.90 threshold for low-income countries.
The question I'd have, though, is that's a poverty level, and there's a poverty level, and there's the extreme poverty level. So what would the extreme poverty level be in Ontario, say, for instance?
But I think actually, the ambition and the agenda here is toward getting people above that poverty level, I think, rather than the extreme poverty level in the policy context and in the terms of the wealth that we have in Ontario. I mean, I think we need to think about poverty as a whole rather than that focus on extreme poverty, which is more of a global perspective than one that we're looking at right here.
John, let me get you to comment first on a comment made here by Anthony Lake. He's the UNICEF Executive Director. He said this 5 years ago. Disaggregate the data, and we find that our statistical national successes are masking moral and practical failures. People are left behind simply because they live in rural communities or urban slums, in conflict zones, as part of Indigenous groups with disabilities, or because they are girls. Do you agree with that notion that somehow when we express these things in national averages, it in effect papers over our moral failings?
Well, I would say two things, and if I may just add on the $1.90 bit, just so we're clear, that is a very specific history of being the poverty line in the 15 poorest, or 15 of the very poorest countries in the world. And then, as was mentioned, it's purchasing power parity. So it's meant to say what would $1.90, and actually in US dollar terms, buy in equivalent terms all around the world. So it really is, Quam's very much right, and everyone is in this conversation, it's an extreme measure of no consumption or no income. And often it's actually even an imputed value, because so much of it is for farmers, where it's measuring what they're consuming when they grow it on their own farms. So there's not even any cash component. It's just what's it worth what they're consuming, which is extremely limited. Even that concept is often not quite as relevant, say in a place like Canada, where you have more access to public services, even when you have maybe very, very, very low income. And this is why I think Brett's point is right, that it's not that it's not relevant in Canada, but the more relevant concept is this one of relative poverty and exclusion, and what's a minimum basket measure of what Canadians define as minimum to participate in society. And this is where I think Tony Lake's comments are very important, because the core phrase, if you will, of the Sustainable Development Goals is no one left behind. This is for each person anywhere in the world to have the means to participate in society, the basic means for basic participation in their community. I would caution against stripping the dignity of 600 million people who are living in extreme poverty. I've had the privilege to work with many of those people, as I think everyone in this conversation has. And there are many extremely dignified people working extremely hard to get themselves over the next threshold for their family. But at the same time, one of the things we see is that, especially where there's large populations or even very narrow targeted populations left behind, that's no longer okay. That's no longer okay for certain in the poorest parts of the world, where it might be large shares of the population getting left behind. But it's not okay in Canada for any segment of the population to get left behind. And I would argue equally in the United States, where you have parts of Appalachia and so forth that feel very much left behind. In Middle England, you have large parts of the population feeling left behind. We have to understand that this isn't just about where you are, but your ability to participate in the progress of the society. And these relative benchmarks are so important to keep at least a fixed goalpost, but also to understand that, as I think Quam said very nicely, we need to have a clear goalpost on over time measuring how we're doing, but we also need to be able to see how people are doing relative to one another, because we're social animals. We live in communities, and our communities need to work.
Quam, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I was actually just agreeing with John, but also agreeing with Brett. The point I was trying to make was I think hardly anybody in Canada is going to be at that extreme poverty level. But I was trying to reflect on that when we're talking about extreme poverty, we're not talking about something that we think is happening a lot here, and we have to move into thinking about relative poverty. I think you can get extreme poverty certainly in Indigenous populations, but it's not, our focus should be on relative poverty. So I'm agreeing with both of them.
Sheldon, if you like, grab another shot of the video board behind us here. And even in the short time that we have been on the air tonight, 1,400 people have been, what's the word we should use here? Liberated from extreme poverty in the world.
Or they liberated themselves.
Good. Better way to put it.
It's not just people rescuing them. They are doing most of the hard work here.
Better way to put it. Let's do a clip here. Here is Harvard University's Steven Pinker, who was on this program not too long ago, discussing not extreme poverty, but inequality, which is another huge problem in the world today. Sheldon, go.
What we should be concerned about is poverty. I don't think inequality is a good thing, but I think it's the wrong thing to take aim at.
Because?
Because what's morally relevant is how well off people are, not that everyone have the same amount of income. That is, we should care about fairness. We should care about people having enough, that they should live pleasant, adequate, stimulating lives. But the fact that there are other people who live even more pleasant lives is not morally relevant. The fact that J.K. Rowling is a billionaire is not a moral outrage. The fact that someone is unemployed, that their children aren't being educated, that they don't have enough to eat, that is a moral concern.
Julia, let me go to you first on that one. What do you think of Steven Pinker's take on inequality?
Well, I couldn't disagree with him more. I think he's focusing on the wrong thing, and I don't think people are focusing on equality, on having everybody have the same income. That is not the argument here. The point is that there is inequality. In Canada, we have growing inequality. There's inequality as a growing danger to sustainable societies around the world. And we need to check that trend towards increasing gaps between the poorest and the richest. I do think it's morally outrageous that there are, according to an Oxfam study, 8 billionaires in the world that have more money than the bottom half of the world's population. That morally outrages me. Obviously, it doesn't outrage Steve, but that is not a world that we should aspire to continue living in. We need to change that. So it's not about everybody having the same income. It's about reducing that gap, narrowing the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest people in society.
At the risk of getting off the path here, let me, since Steven Pinker isn't here to defend himself, ask you to consider this follow-up. Putting it in his words, why should we care if J.K. Rowling's a billionaire? She's written a lot of very popular books that people seem to like. Why is that morally outrageous to you?
So it's not about her in particular. I don't know her situation, but it's often the case, unfortunately, that people that accumulate that level of wealth are not necessarily paying their fair share of taxes, for example, contributing back to societies that helped educate them, that helped provide them with social services, etc. So there is a problem. It's not a sustainable way of moving forward in our societies if there's increasing amount of wealth and income accumulated by fewer and fewer numbers. Oxfam has been tracking this for years now, and they started off with, I think, you could fit everybody in a bus, all the billionaires in a bus that owned more or had more wealth than half of the world's bottom half of the population. And now we're talking about 8 individuals that have more wealth than half of the world's population. That is not a sustainable model for a society. So there is a real issue that we need to address here. Again, I say it's closing that gap. It's not aspiring that everybody has the same income, but making sure that there are systems in place so that wealth is shared in society through different mechanisms, and that we don't have people who are in extreme poverty while at the same time you have people who are wealthier than to a degree that they can't do much with that wealth to feed back into society.
Sure. Brett, I mean, it's indisputable. I think the numbers show that in certainly the developed world, income inequality has become an increasing problem over the last 10, 20 years. I think partially explains the rise of Trump in the United States. But what if you take the global perspective? What if you go and include the developing world in that as well? Is that still as big a problem?
Well, if you look globally, inequality has shrunk, in part because of the progress that's been made on Millennium Development Goal 1 and now the first SDG. But within developed or industrialized economies, you have seen a widening in inequality, particularly for low-wage workers who have been on the wrong side of technological change, or people in rural or isolated regions that have seen shifts in which industries are doing well and one industry town's potentially shut down. And that's why I think Pinker is taking far too narrow a view on poverty and inequality by dismissing inequality as an issue here for moral concern. As we discussed earlier, poverty has multiple dimensions, as Kwame mentioned. It's not just income, it's also what that income allows you to do in terms of political and broader participation in society. And I won't take on the moral issue, but from a practical perspective, as an economist sitting here, I think we've got some pretty clear indications that society, industries, the economy doesn't work particularly well when inequality gets to extremes. Mm-hmm. So it's not an issue of what the billionaires are doing, it's what's happening to that lower end of the tail, and are people at the lowest income levels actually above a threshold that allows them to participate, to learn, to work effectively. We know that many of the industries, service sectors that require people in large numbers at relatively low wages aren't going to work very well if those people aren't adequately fed, adequately housed, adequately educated.
Do I hear you right in as much as, are you a Bay Street banker arguing for much higher personal income taxes on Bay Street bankers so that we can help the bottom third of society?
I mean, that is your inference from that, but that isn't the only policy inference that comes from that. There are a lot of ways of tackling inequality, some of which is through growth, doing the things that allow an economy to expand so that that pie is getting bigger. But then in terms of thinking about how it's distributed, different types of growth distribute that pie in different ways, and different policy measures can actually affect how that pie gets distributed. So minimum wage, earned income tax credits, universal basic income, other social support programs. Education, we know, is one of the most empowering ways of ensuring that people get access to participation in society. Saying that it's a call for raising taxes is one of only a large number of arrows in the quiver we've got.
Quinn.
Well, I'll pay more taxes, would happily do so if it was shared more equally. It's a strange place, I think, Harvard. It must be a very strange place to believe that if you've got limited resources, the way you share them is not a moral issue. Very, very odd way of looking at the world. Very difficult to comment on it because it seems such an odd way of looking at the world. Everybody knows that, I don't know whether they found the gene for fairness yet, but we're hardwired to believe that the world should be, a fairer place. And it doesn't have to be completely equal. From a health perspective, when you look at a Gini coefficient, which is a way of looking at inequality, 0, we're perfectly equal, 1, we're perfectly unequal. It's when you get over about 0.3 that you start having the health impacts of income inequality. That's what some of the modelling seems to show. So it's not saying we can't have any difference between rich and poor. It's saying that those extreme differences have impacts socially, they have impacts on health, and there are social cancer. They pull us apart. There has never been a world where dividing people has created success. It never happens.
Can I jump in on that again?
Please, Julia.
Just, I think it would be important to convey to your viewers that Steve's view is quite unique in the sense that there is a growing consensus, and this is a happy consensus in our point of view, around the importance of inequality, and that it is one of the major obstacles that we face for, a sustainable future. That and climate change are often evoked jointly. So, the number of people who are out there not wanting to recognize that inequality is a major issue and that we need to tackle it is really almost non-existent. I mean, years ago, a couple of decades ago, it was only, kind of progressive civil society that was pointing fingers at inequality. Now, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, it's, major main topic of discussion. Everybody's agreeing that this is an issue. So I thought it was important to put that in perspective.
Good. John, let me get you to address one of the Sustainable Development Goal number 1's sub-goals. And Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring this up here. The sub-goal says by 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. Now, you've looked at the numbers, and I'm wondering how, in your view, Canada is doing at tackling Sustainable Development Goal number 1.
Well, on the domestic poverty side, Canada doesn't actually have its own poverty line. It has a variety of measures of low income status. My favorite is the so-called market basket measure, which looks at how many people can afford a specific basket of goods that's priced to their local geography. There's a few others, so-called low income cutoff and low income measure, that look at relative incomes. But I think that's the most analogous to the extreme poverty measure is this market basket measure. Canada has been steady at around 10 to 12% of its population, so it's more than 3.5 million odd people who are living at that level of poverty. And so the implication is we would need to cut that by half by 2030. So by 2030, population of Canada will probably be more than 40 million people. We're a growing country. And so that would mean we'll have to get it down, to certainly below 2 million people. And so this is the type of indicator that I think can help not just our national conversation, but it can help our provincial conversations. Each province has its own measure of this, say, market basket standard. Each city and community can have its own benchmark. So this can be a very, very local measure of progress in how we're doing. And if I could just add on the inequality bit, I think one of the very important pieces to note here is that this is not a fixed pie. So often this is described as how are we spreading the pie as it is today. I think the inequality debate is about two things. It's really about, is this a rigged game? So I don't think many people are criticizing J.K. Rowling because she's seen, I think, if anything, as a very progressive voice looking out for others. It's much more if it's seen as people who are protecting themselves, people who are buying legislation, people who are setting the rules to protect their money or even hide their money. And a lot of global concern came out of the financial crisis in that vein. But the other piece, I think, is social mobility. So based on your income level, do you have a chance to do better? Do you have a chance for your kids to do better? This is very basic stuff. And even though globally inequality has been getting better, and in most countries outside of the handful that have been mentioned, there hasn't been a huge change, actually, not as much as people think in the past 20 years or so. But there has been a change in many countries in terms of which families can climb the ladder of success, if you will. And I think this is a huge issue because what we really, really need to care about isn't just today, it's this question of tomorrow. Who gets to do well tomorrow? And in Canada, we've been talking a lot about the middle class. What this helps us think about is who's getting left behind, who's left out of even the middle class. But also, it's not just how many of those can climb, but it's how each person in each part of society has the chance, again, to do better tomorrow.
To that end, Brett, you know, in the province of Ontario, we are experimenting at the moment with something called the Basic Income Pilot Program. Is there a way to eradicate poverty in the province of Ontario if this doesn't move from pilot program to general government policy across all cities and towns?
Well, the pilot that's in place in Ontario is in 3 communities, in Lindsay, Brantford, and the Thunder Bay area. It's experimenting with providing direct income transfers to people that substantially exceed what is provided under Ontario social assistance. So for a single person, they're getting around $16,900 compared with around $8,000 in the past under social assistance. And for a family, it's moving to around $24,000, $25,000. The notion there is to look at how we can provide a basic guarantee of well-being through a simpler and more streamlined system by providing those direct cash transfers rather than sometimes onerous process of applying for social assistance, applying for Ontario disability benefits, and looking at the impacts then on the number of social indicators of well-being. Does this reduce the number of trips to hospital? Does this improve educational attendance in families that are receiving this kind of support? And what we're looking at really in the future is this type of delivery method as a potential way of ensuring the economic and social security of individuals and families.
So you're a fan of it?
Well, I think it's something we really need to look at, and that's why it was a really, I think, useful project to bring forward, because we know that the nature of work is changing. There's greater precarity in work in many sectors. There are some types of jobs that are never coming back, and there are some people who have worked in those sectors who will find it very difficult to retrain. This provides at least a floor on their income, but it also provides room for them to engage potentially in entrepreneurship, because the clawbacks that happen are much more limited for income that they earn over and above this basic income compared with the disincentives to work in some of our social assistance programs. And it ought to be the sort of thing that gets political support from across the spectrum. If you're a conservative, you ought to like the idea because it's empowering, it's focused on individual choice, and it's probably reducing bureaucracy. It takes far fewer people to administer. On the progressive or left of the political spectrum, you ought to like the fact that it's increasing the net resource transfer to people, and it's also empowering poor people in a way that some of the paternalism of government programs doesn't. And it also is much easier to access. So instead, though, we're often hearing criticisms both sides of the spectrum. On the right, they say this is just a handout. And on the left, they're saying, well, this is a kind of Trojan horse that's going to lead to the cutback in other programs. I don't think either of those things are true. I think there's great potential here, which is why it's being tried in a number of other jurisdictions around the world as well. And what we need is to actually go through the full 3-year pilot, get good data out of it, and see what the results are. And then we'll see where we go forward.
I'm afraid, friends, that's our time. We've had a great discussion here on TVO tonight about Sustainable Development Goal #1. So thanks to John MacArthur in our Washington, D.C. studio. He's with the Brookings Institution. Julia Sanchez, President, CEO of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. Back here in our studio, Quam McKenzie from the Wellesley Institute and the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and Brett House, Deputy Chief Economist, VP at Scotiabank, and a former Principal Economic Advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Thanks, everybody. Great to have you on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.